Boldwood presents Echoes of the Past, written by Evelyn Hood and read by Kirsty Cox. This book contains references to incest. Reader discretion is advised. Chapter 1. You know your trouble, Weem Lowrie. You're lazy, that's what. Bone idle. Always were and always will be. And God forgive me for ever taking you on as a husband, Jess railed. Lying there and leaving me to deal with all the worry of your own bairns and me getting too old for the task. And look at the state of you. Am I never to be done running around after you and tidying up your mess? She plucked irritably at the single weed that had dared to plant itself on the grassy green mound and put it into her pocket to dispose of later, then clambered to her feet and rubbed vigorously at the gravestone with the cloth she had brought specially. A year after their carving, the letters stood out clear and strong, claiming the 6-foot rectangle of ground before them for William James Lowrie, fisherman of the parish of Buckie, born 1870, died 21st July 1911, beloved husband of Jess Innes and father of James, Bethany and Innes. Her work done, Jess stepped back and surveyed the grave, head to one side. There was not a speck of dust on the stone, not so much as a fallen leaf on the grass. The mixed bunch of flowers she had brought from her tiny backyard had been arranged neatly in a glass jar, and for the moment, at least, her man was neat, tidy, and seen to. You're fine here, aren't you, Weem, where I can tend to you? Her voice was anxious, and she bit her lower lip as she glanced at the fields surrounding the small graveyard. It would have been more fitting for a man who had spent most of his life on the sea to be buried within sight and sound of its waves. But since the small fishing town of Buckie did not have its own graveyard, the Buckie dead had to be buried in Raffin Cemetery on the high hill above their own small part of Buckie, with its huddled houses and narrow cobbled streets. Jess took comfort in the thought that on days like today, with the high grey clouds scudding across it like ghostly sails, the great stretch of sky above the graveyard could well be likened to the ocean. Aye, you're fine, she answered her own question. I just wish to God that your bairns could be put to rights as easy as you are, Weem. Even as she spoke, she knew that there was no sense in talking to him about such matters, for he had always left the worrying to her. She sniffed, used the cloth she had brought for the gravestone to mop at the tears that had spilled over of their own accord, then put it back into her bag and brushed the skirt of her coat. I'll be back next week, same as always. After picking up the bag, she made her way out of the graveyard, straight-backed and with her head held high. Fields of young corn to each side of the road rippled and swayed in waves beneath the wind. Again, the similarity to the sea was obvious, but deep in her heart, Jess knew that similarities would mean nothing to her Weem, for he had never had much time for the land. As she came within sight of Buckie, nestling on the shores of the Murray Firth and clustered for the most part round the harbour, guilt tramped alongside her as it had done since the day she had claimed her husband from the sea and laid him in the black earth. Jess lifted her chin higher and quickened her step, trying to appreciate the bright yellow magnificence of the broom bushes by the road and the delicate beauty of the pink and white wild roses. The decision to bury her man in the ground instead of letting their son James return him to the huge rolling sea had been hers, made in the full knowledge that she must live with the consequences for the rest of her life. She had not realised then that it would cause such a deep rift between herself and her firstborn, the son who was so like Weem in nature. She had intended to go straight home, but when she reached the town, she hesitated, then turned towards the huddle of houses known as the Cat Bow. As she neared her daughter's house, a small, brown-haired tornado detached itself from a group of children and hurtled towards her, crashing into her knees and locking itself there with sturdy little arms. "Granny Jess! Rory Pate yelled up at her, his blue eyes wide and angelic in his dirty face. Where have you been? To London to see the Queen. Did she send me anything? Aye, a facecloth and a bar of soap, she retorted, rummaging in her bag. But I must have left them behind, so you'll have to have this instead. Rory's eyes lit up at the sight of the licorice strap, and he released her knees to snatch at it with one hand. Is your mother busy? No, she's just talking to Aunt Stella. I was playing with the bairns, but they all got too tired and went to sleep. They're too wee to play, 4-year-old Rory said scornfully. He accompanied her to the door, then darted off again, leaving her on her own. Are you in then? She called, tapping gently at the door before lifting the latch. Most local women were free to walk into their own daughters' homes without having to announce their arrival. But then most local women did not have a daughter like Bethany. All day, Bethany Pate had dreaded a meeting with her mother. She had been trying hard, without success, to keep thoughts of her once-adored father at bay on this first anniversary of his death. But despite all her efforts, he had pushed himself into her mind at every opportunity. To make matters worse, her sister-in-law Stella had been sitting in Bethany's small kitchen since early afternoon, talking about Weem Lowrie. I'm just glad that James is away at the fishing, for I don't know what he'd have been like if he'd been home all day. He'd not have let it made any difference. Bethany had little time, even when she was in a good mood, for Stella's assumption that because her twins were nearly the same age as Bethany's stepdaughter Ellen, the two women had a lot in common. It never seemed to occur to Stella that Bethany, not having given birth herself, might not be interested in continuous talk of bairns and domesticity. You don't know what he's been like since his father went. He's not the same man at all. I never know what way to take him. James was always difficult. It's in his nature. It's a family thing. In Bethany's hands, the knitting needles flew along the row, turned and flew back, the points stabbing into the thick wool. She was knitting a jersey for her husband, while Stella worked at a jacket for one of the twins. Ennis is a good civil soul, and your mother's the same. James inherited his nature from our father, same as me. It was all Bethany could do not to throw the knitting into Stella's bland face. No wonder James was difficult at times, she thought with a stab of pity for her older brother. Having to spend his time ashore with a woman who could talk of nothing but bairns and cooking, and bairns and mending, and more bairns, would turn any man morose. And James had been moody to start with. But you'd think, Stella began, then stopped short as they heard the tentative tap on the outer door and the voice from the street. It's her? Your mother? Her brown eyes, guileless as a child's, flooded with concern. I know my mother's own voice. Should I say something about... No. Bethany put the knitting aside and got up to fetch a cup as her mother came into the kitchen, crooning at the sight of the 3 infants drowsing, exhausted from their games, in an intertwined, boneless heap on the hearthrug. They woke at the sound of her voice, reaching stubby arms up to her and chattering like a nestful of baby birds. Jess sank onto the chair Bethany had vacated and managed to gather them all into her lap. Aren't you the bonniest bairns in the whole of the Firth? She asked them. And I'd not sell one of you for £1,000. You'll not be able to take your tea now, Bethany said irritably from the stove. I'll manage fine. I'm used to bairns climbing all over me. With difficulty, Jess tucked 16-month-old Ellen and 15-month-old Sarah and Annie into the crook of one arm and reached out with her free hand for the mug of sweet black tea. Sit nice now, my wee birdies, for Granny Jess. She drank it down swiftly and handed the cup back. That was good. I'd a thirst on me. Have you been walking to Rathen and back? Stella asked. Jess shot a look at Bethany, who devoted all her attention to washing her mother's empty cup. Aye, pet. I just took a stroll up the hill. On your loan? Me and the bairns would have gone with you if you'd asked. I'd not have you walking that distance when you're so near to your time. The children were squirming to get down now, and Jess was glad of the diversion. She lowered them to the floor, then pulled her own knitting wires from the leather pad known locally as a whisker slung from her belt. Buckie women never let a moment lie idle, and if there was nothing of greater urgency for their hands to do, there was always knitting or darning. How are you keeping, Stella? Well enough, wearying for the time to come. The girl hesitated, then said shyly, If it's a boy, I thought to call him Weem, after his grandfather. But is that what James wants? Bethany asked tartly, returning to her chair. I've not asked him yet. I wanted to speak to Mother Jess first. Stella beamed at Jess, who hesitated, glancing over at her daughter. Bethany, head bent, was intent on her knitting. It's a kind thought, lass, but I think James should have the final word on the matter. Stella's mouth drooped a little. He wasn't interested in naming the lassies. If it's a laddie, that'll change. Bethany's voice was brittle. Sons count more than daughters. Sons can carry on the family tradition and the family name. Daughters aren't of much use. You think so? Stella asked nervously, eyeing her little daughters and placing a protective hand on the great swell of her belly. Then, putting her knitting needles away, she began to ease herself up from her chair. I'd best go. The bairns'll be getting hungry. I'll come with you and help you with the wee ones, Jess offered. Outside, Stella said, Bethany's in a right black mood today. She snapped at me more than once before you came in, and I can't think what I did to deserve it. It's not your fault, pet. We've all got our ups and downs. Aye, I suppose so. I just thought it would be nice for the two of us to spend some time together. Even with my father and the bairns to see to, the house seems awful empty when James is at the fishing. Aye. Jess felt sorry for the girl, knowing full well how hard it was to be head over heels in love with a man who did not possess a grain of romance in his soul. Why not come along to my house for a wee while? Best not. My dad'll be ready for his tea. How is he? Buckie, a former fisherman, had been in poor health. Not too bad. The worst of his troubles is the way he's still pining for the sea, even though he's been ashore these 3 years past. My own father was the same when he got too old to go out on the boats. Once the sea gets them, it never lets go. The words were out of Jess's mouth before she realised it, and, as she walked the short distance to her own house after parting with Stella, they came clamouring back, filling her head until her ears rang. Worse still, they were being shouted, not in her own voice, but in Weem's. Once the sea gets them, it never lets go. How could any woman who knew the truth of that have kept her man's body back from the sea, which had been more dear to him than anything else? For love, Weem, for love, she muttered, and didn't realise she had said it aloud until 2 little girls, scurrying towards her hand in hand, hesitated, looked at each other, giggled, and gave her a wide berth as they ran past. Hello, Innes. Zelda. Weem Lowrie, intent on the piece of machinery on the bench before him, greeted the newcomer brusquely without turning to look at her. Unabashed, Griselda Mulholland found a corner where she was out of his way and waited. She enjoyed watching Innes at work. She liked the gravity that overlaid his normally cheerful face, the narrowing of the dark eyes, the way his strong, long-fingered hands moved deftly among what to her were lumps of metal, but to him were objects of beauty. After a few moments he straightened, wiping his oily hands on a rag, then turning to give her his usual broad grin. What brings you here? Johnny had to bring one of the cart horses to be shod, and wee Peter wanted to come to the smiddy to see the work being done. Zelda was employed as a maid at a farm in Raffin, helping the farmer's busy wife to tend the hens, make the cheese, and see to the house and the large family. Again? Wee Peter's been here that often to see the horses shod that he must be able to do it himself by now. Bairns like Smiddies. She hoisted herself up to sit on the rough wood of his workbench, swinging her legs. You're not complaining, are ye? If I'm in your way, just say and I'll be off. I'm not complaining a bit, Miss Griselda. Innes leaned on the bench, enjoying the way the girl pouted at the mention of her full name. Don't say that. Is it my fault my family have long names? When I have... She stopped short, flushing and looking up at him from beneath her lashes. If I have bairns, they'll be given proper names like Anne and Mary and John. I think Zelda's a fine name. Innes wiped the sweat from his face with the rag he still held. Because the blacksmith who employed him had his furnace positioned against the brick wall between workshop and smiddy, both places were always hot to work in. At least it's better than Grizzle. That's what my aunt's called. That wouldn't suit you, not with your bonny nature. Zelda flushed with pleasure at the compliment, then poked a finger at the metal he had been working on. What's that? Part of a motor car? Just a bit from a reaper. I wish it was a motor car, Innes said longingly. We don't see many of them hereabouts. Zelda! A small boy appeared in the doorway, face flushed with heat from the blacksmith's fire. He stamped in and clutched at the maid's hand. I want to go home. I don't like it here. Yes, you do. I don't, Peter insisted. You know I don't. Why do we have to keep coming? Don't you be cheeky. And what are you laughing at, Innes Lowrie? Zelda snapped, flustered by the little boy's revelations. Nothing at all. That rag you wiped your face with has left dirt all over your cheek, she said, and flounced out, towing Peter behind her. In the doorway, she turned. Will you come up to the farm for me later? I can't tonight. My mother'll maybe want me to go to Raffin Cemetery with her. It's been a year since... The girl took a step back towards him. Oh, Innes, I forgot about your father. I'm sorry. It's all right. I'll come up tomorrow night. She beamed and nodded, then hurried off, leaving Innes to return to his work. Jess was stirring the soup when the youngest of her 3 children arrived home from work. Are you all right? He asked as soon as he came in the door. Why wouldn't? She began, then changed it to, aye, lad, I'm fine. Then, eyeing his dirty overalls, get yourself washed now. Your dinner'll be on the table in a minute. She'd never become used to the streaks of oil on Innes's dungarees, or the smell of it. Your clean shirt's over the back of that chair. Unlike her own mother, Jess had the luxury of a cold water tap in her kitchen, but Innes, a thoughtful lad, always insisted on washing the day's grime off at the big sink in the outhouse. Whistling, he went out the back with a kettle of hot water, while Jess rattled the pots busily on the stove. Although she had always tried not to favour one of her children over the others, her last-born was more precious to her than his older brother and sister. For one thing, he was still under her roof and therefore in her care. For another, he was the only one of the 3 with whom she felt comfortable. Innes had been a loving and giving soul from the moment of his birth, whereas James and Bethany had both shrugged off embraces from an early age. Now that they were grown, there were times when she felt quite uncomfortable with them, while with Innes she could say and do as she wished, without fear of being laughed at or criticised. I thought the 2 of us might take a walk up to Raffin after, he said casually when he returned to the kitchen, sleeking his wet hair back with both hands and reaching for the shirt. It's all right, laddie. I went to see your father this afternoon. On your loan? Did Bethany not think to go with you? He asked when she nodded. I didn't ask her. Would you mind just having your own company when you go there later? I'll stay in with you instead. To tell the truth, I paid my respects this morning before work. Maybe Bethany went on her own too. Maybe. Then there's James. He'd be too busy catching herring to remember. Jess put the soup bowls on the table and sat down. James has his own life to live now. Weem had always predicted that he would die at sea and rest there, but in actual fact, he had died of a sudden, massive heart attack on board the Fidelity, the steam drifter that he, his brother Albert and James jointly owned. James had wanted to honour his father's wishes by putting the body over the side there and then, but Albert had insisted on leaving the final decision to Jess. Despite James's arguing and, eventually, his pleading, she had settled for a burial, unable to face the thought of losing her man completely to the sea, with no grave to visit. Since then, James had scarcely had anything to do with her. It was as though she had lost a son, as well as a husband. Chapter 2. When her stepchildren were in bed and asleep, and the dishes had been done, Bethany pulled a shawl over her head. "I'm just going down to visit my mother." Gil Pate, settled by the fire with his pipe and the newspaper, reached up and caught his wife's hand as she moved past his chair. "Do you have to go out?" His strong fingers caressed the soft skin on the inside of her wrist. "I feel that I should. It's a year to the day since my father went. She gets lonely." It was an excuse she had often used in the past months, when she needed to get away from the house to walk by herself in the fresh air, away from the cloying domestic responsibilities. "She's not on her loan. There's still Innes at home." "He's never there. You should know what laddies are like." "Laddies have to go out looking for companionship," Gil said, his fingers stroking and stroking. "But a man has the right to find it there at his own hearthside." "You won't miss me for an hour. You'll have your nose in the newspaper for longer than that and the bairns will not be any trouble. They're sound asleep and they'll stay like that till the morning." "I like to know you're sitting on the other side of the fire, knitting away all bonny and contented," he sulked. "Just an hour, that's all." She drew her hand away gently, but firmly. "If you must, you must. But don't take all night about it. It's time Jess realised that you're a wife now, and that's more than a daughter." Once over the doorstep, Bethany drew the night air deep into her lungs with a great shuddering sigh before walking briskly down the hill towards Cluny Harbour. At that time of year, most of the Buckie fleet was fishing the waters round Shetland, Orkney and Caithness, and the few boats left in the harbour rode high in the water, occasionally nudging against each other. For a moment she drew the peace of the place into her soul. Then, turning away from the water, she moved in the opposite direction from her mother's house, keeping her head down and her shawl drawn close about her face. The road to Raffin was quiet, and all too soon the larger monuments in the cemetery were outlined against the cool blue-grey of the evening sky. Then she had reached it, and the iron of the gate was cold and hard beneath her fingers. She knew exactly where her father's grave lay. She could even see his stone from where she hesitated, clinging to the gate. Over the past year, she had often walked up the hill to this place, but she had never been able to take that first step into the cemetery. It was the same story tonight. Before peace could be made with her father's memory, she would have to come to terms with the conflicting emotions within her own soul. She would have to relinquish something, either the deep love she'd had for the man from her earliest days, or the bitter rage born of knowing that he had used her love and trust to further his own interests, trapping her in the process with a man who meant nothing to her. Bethany's fingers tightened painfully on the gate. Letting go of the rage meant that she must resign herself to becoming what Weem had made of her, a wife and mother with no other identity. And she could not do that. Not yet, perhaps not ever. She turned away from the graveyard and started back down the road towards home. Once in sight of the Firth, she could see the lights of a group of sailed fishing boats sliding out of the harbour below. Although its fishing fleet was second to only that of Lowestoft in size, Buckie was badly situated for the large fishing grounds, and during the busiest seasons, its boats were obliged to stay away from home for weeks at a time, discharging their catches and recoaling in more accessible ports. The sailed boats, smaller than the steam drifters and dependent on wind and weather, were less able to reach the big fishing grounds and concentrated on line fishing in the deeper waters of the Moray Firth. The boats below, passing in stately procession through the harbour entrance with their masthead lights twinkling in the gloaming, would be back in the morning with their catches. Once out of the harbour, they dipped and bounced, moving apart and picking up speed as the wind caught their spread sails. Bethany watched hungrily, longing to be on board and heading for the open sea with no thought for the land falling away behind her. Back in the town, she returned to the harbour, standing at the very edge, looking down into the deep, still water, where, as a bairn, she had swum with the lads, heedless of the future. She had certainly never anticipated that it would bring marriage and a ready-made family. While the other lassies had played with dolls, and as they grew from childhood dreamed of their own homes and their own men and their own bairns, Bethany had had other plans. Even though she knew that women did not crew on fishing boats, she secretly hoped that her father, who could deny her nothing, might break the unwritten rules specially for her. But Weem was as superstitious as any fisherman, and, on leaving school, Bethany was set to work in one of the smokehouses, then became a gutting quine, as the fisher lassies were known in the area. Frustrated, she had then come up with another scheme. The gutting quine, employed by fish curers, coopers, or buyers, worked in 3-woman teams, with 2 gutters and 1 packer to each team. Once brought ashore, the fish were emptied from baskets into the farlands, wooden troughs similar to the deep sinks used for washing clothes. Salt was scattered over the herring to make them easier to grip, and in seconds the gutter's sharp knives slit the fish open and scooped the entrails out. The gutted fish was tossed into a tub on one side of each gutter and entrails into a tub on her other side. The packer arranged the fish in the barrels, an outer ring and an inner ring, with a space between each fish to avoid damaging them. The layers were separated by handfuls of coarse salt. The work was hard, and when the fishing was good, the gutting quine might work at the farlands for 12 to 15 hours with only short breaks for meals. For this they were paid 3 pence an hour, plus 10 pence per barrel, to be divided between the 3 women in the team. It had occurred to Bethany that an ambitious, hard-working woman could take over the running of the teams, renting their services out, bargaining with the curers and coopers, and possibly earning more money for the teams and for herself, money that, carefully and patiently hoarded over the years, might eventually enable her to buy her own boat one day and pick her own crew to work it. With this secret aim in mind, Bethany had set herself to work hard at the farlands. Once the herring were landed, they had to be gutted, sorted, salted and packed as fast as possible. Usually there were 1 or 2 experienced women working alongside the teams, ready to step in and take over if someone had to drop out for any reason. Bethany, her hands as fast as her mind, had swiftly learned the art of gutting, and by being in the right place at the right time, had become a supervisor. The next step had been to gather the women together and persuade them to consider working for themselves instead of for the menfolk. But while she was waiting for the right time, fate, in the form of her beloved father, had stepped in and ruined everything. Since childhood, Bethany had had striking looks. Her curly hair was long and thick, brown like her father's, but with a rich mahogany glow to it that came from her mother's colouring. She possessed her mother's good bones and her father's clear grey eyes which, in Bethany's case, could change in an instant from warm velvet to the hard, cold grey of slate, or become as stormy as a wild sea, or glitter like silvered spray. Full grown, she was slightly on the tall side for a woman with a body that was feminine yet sturdy. Like her older brother James, she was never short of admirers, but while James, in his bachelor days, enjoyed the attentions of blushing lassies, Bethany had no time for the youths who sought to court her. Her natural ability to supervise others, combined with her youthful good health and striking looks, had caught the sight of her employer, a cooper by the name of Gilbert Pate. Although Gil already had a wife, he would have bedded Bethany willingly if she had shown any signs of being agreeable to it. The other women at the Farlands had joshed her about Gil's interest, some with amusement, and others, the younger ones who thought the cooper a good-looking man, with a certain amount of jealousy. Unfortunately, James had heard of it and had teased her unmercifully in their father's hearing, something that Weem Lowrie remembered when Gil's wife died in childbed, leaving him in sore need of someone to look after his home and his 2 children. Gil was ripe for the picking, and Weem Lowrie had never been one to let a chance go by. Only months after burying his first wife, Gil had taken Bethany as his second, and Weem and Albert Lowrie had secured an arrangement to sell all the Fidelity's future catches to Gil and his brother Nathan, a curer, at a price that suited all 4 men. Nobody had asked for Bethany's views on the matter. And now, she thought bitterly, it was too late to do anything about it. She had made her bed. The unfortunate but apt phrase reminded her that time was passing all too quickly while she stood there, still as a figurehead, lost in her own thoughts. And time was no longer hers to squander. Shivering in the cool air, she wrenched herself away from the sea and went slowly back to the cottage where Gil was asleep in his chair, legs stretched across the hearth, his newspaper spread across his deep chest, his mouth open and snoring. As Bethany closed the door, he choked in mid-snore and struggled upright in his chair, wiping drool from his chin and glancing at the clock. "You were a good while." "We got to talking." He reached up and touched her fingers as she went by his chair. "You're chilled." "I went down to the harbour to look at the boats on my way back." She picked up the poker and bent to stir life and warmth into the glowing range, but he put his paper aside and got up to take the poker from her. "Leave it." "I'm cold." "I'll warm you in the bed," Gil said huskily, his hands busy. "The bairns?" "There's not been a murmur from them all the time you've been gone." He pulled her to him, one arm about her waist, his free hand clutching hers and pushing it against his swelling crotch. "They have your attention during the day. The night time's mine," he said into her neck. "I'll just make sure they're settled. Then I'll be back," Bethany said, and escaped to the small room at the back of the house, just large enough for 2 cribs. Rory and Ellen were both sound asleep, Ellen on her stomach, and Rory on his back, arms and legs spread like the tentacles of a starfish. They were good bairns, and she was fond enough of them, but in the same way she tolerated all young things, such as kittens or puppies. Watching Stella and the other women, she knew that she lacked their maternal feelings. Perhaps if she had children of her own. But the very thought made her flesh creep. Gil, who fortunately seemed content with the 2 bairns he already had no knowledge of the ways in which his young wife guarded herself against an unwanted pregnancy. "Bethany," Gil, already in his long nightshirt, said from the doorway. "Come on, woman. I want my sleep." "I'm just going out to the privy first." She lingered there, in the smelly, spidery dark, hoping that he might fall asleep, but knowing he would not. Young and healthy, and with a natural appetite for life and all it had to offer, she had enjoyed her bridegroom's attentions at first, but after a few months her duties as a bedded wife had become tedious. Why, she had no idea, but she suspected that it might be because Gil was not of her own choosing. When she returned to the warm, dark kitchen, lit only by a faint glow from the range, Gil was awake, and too impatient to wait until she had brushed her hair out and put her nightgown on. Bouncing rhythmically on the mattress, her scalp pierced by straying hairpins, Bethany stared beyond her husband's head at the ceiling and thought of her father, who had engineered this marriage to suit his own purposes. Weem had been unable to understand why his beloved daughter had become so withdrawn from him after her marriage, and it had hurt Bethany to see his bewilderment. She had always assumed that one day, when the hurt had eased and she was ready to forgive him for pushing her into this marriage, they would become close again. Then suddenly Weem was dead, and it was too late. As Gil rolled onto his own side of the bed and began, almost at once, to snore, she stared at the dull glow of the fire and wondered if the continuous, seething restlessness within her would have eased and vanished if she had been able to make her peace with her father. Busy as James Lowrie was that day, his father was not out of his thoughts all through the journey to the fishing grounds off Caithness. It was a relief when they were ready to shoot the nets not long after darkness fell, for it was an exercise that involved every member of the crew and gave them little time to think. In the rope locker, an area little more than a cupboard below deck, the ship's lad feverishly paid out the messenger, the thick, tarry rope that held the nets. At the same time, the huge nets themselves were being fed carefully from their hold onto the deck, where one man attached the corks that kept the nets suspended from the sea's surface and the buoys that would indicate their position, while another passed the netting strop ropes to James, who made them fast to the messenger and sent them on their way overboard, on the starboard side of the boat, since it was considered bad luck to shoot the nets to port. "I'll stand watch," James said 2 hours later, when the others stretched cramped, weary limbs and looked longingly towards the galley, where the deckhand who doubled as a cook was already starting to prepare their supper. The boat had been brought round head to wind, and the mizzen set to hold her there. Below the surface of the water, their presence indicated by floats at regular intervals, some 2 to 3 miles of drift nets spread out from Fidelity, hanging in curtains, waiting for the herring to swim into the trap set for them. Albert Lowrie, square-built like his late brother, though without Weem's height, narrowed his eyes as he stared out into the darkness. "It's a quiet enough night. She'll not move much. I doubt if we'll need any more swing rope. You get below. Malky can stand tonight," he told his nephew. James shook his head and repeated with a bite to his voice, "I said I'll watch." Albert shrugged, then nodded to the other men, who tumbled into the galley at once, eager to get out of the wind that chilled now that they were idle. It was a relief to James when his uncle followed them. He was in no mood that night to be shut up with the others, listening to their endless talk. He lit a cigarette, drawing the tobacco deep into his lungs. It was dark, apart from the carbide lamp fixed forward of the wheelhouse and the oil lamp at the mast. Around him, he knew, a vast fleet was scattered over the fishing grounds, tossing on the heavy but regular swell, though in the darkness all he could see was an occasional masthead light and the quick froth of a wave top now and again. Like his father and sister, James loved the sea more than anything else. He loved its contrary moods, the worst of them as well as the best. He loved the sight and sound of it, its salty kiss on his lips, the harpy screaming of a gale in the rigging. When first he went to sea, he had been taught his craft by his father on one of 2 sailed Zulu fishing boats owned by Zachary Lowrie, his grandfather. A shrewd and ambitious man, Zachary had put one boat in the care of Weem, the older of his 2 sons and the better fisherman, while he himself was skipper of the other, with his younger son Albert as mate. The arrangement had worked amicably until Weem, shrewd and ambitious as his father, set eyes on one of the first steam drifters in Lowestoft during an English fishing season. He had done all he could to persuade his father to sell both Zulus and invest in steam, but Zachary would have no truck with the newfangled steam kettles. James could still remember every word of the quarrels that flew between them each time they met.
"Do you know the cost of one of these things? £3,000 and more. I've never been in debt in my life, and I'll not be in debt in old age," Zachary had thundered.
Weem stood his ground.
"You're well enough known and well enough respected to get a good loan from the North of Scotland Bank. The sale of the 2 Zulus would pay off some of the money."
Zachary took his pipe from his mouth and gobbed a mouthful of phlegm into the fire.
"They'd fetch next to nothing compared to the cost of a steam drifter.
And once we're able to reach the fishing grounds in all weathers without fear of being becalmed," Weem ploughed on doggedly, refusing to be diverted from his dream,
"we could soon make up the rest. And there's you and Albert and the rest of the crew to be paid, and an engine driver and a trimmer to feed the furnace," the old man pointed out. "I'm fine as I am. Once I cover the cost of my sails, the wind's free. So hold your tongue, Weem, for I'll not have any more of this nonsense, and that's final."
He humphed and bit so hard on the stem of his pipe that James expected it to snap in two. Then he took it from his mouth to add,
"When I'm gone, you'll probably win Albert round, for you always were a silver-tongued bugger, and he's a fool, more interested in fathering bairns than making sensible decisions, but you'll never get me to change my mind."
The door of the galley clanged back on its hinges now, and Jem, the younger of the 2 bastard sons Albert had brought on board the Fidelity as crew members, arrived on deck with a mug of hot tea and a sandwich big enough to warrant the title of doorstop. "My dad says I've to take over the watch if you want to go below."
"I'm fine where I am,"
James told him shortly, and the lad, recently promoted from ship's boy to deckhand, shrugged and ducked back into the warm fug of the galley. As the door opened, James heard the low rumble of voices from the cabin below, and the soft strains of his cousin Charlie's mouth organ. The rest of the crew would be clustered round the table in the small pitching cabin, smoking and drinking mugs of strong tea sweetened with condensed milk. They were welcome to it. Give him the open air and the sea and his own company any day. He ate and drank without tasting the food or noticing the scalding sting of the tea. Then he hunched into the shelter of the wheelhouse to light another cigarette, sucking the smoke deep into his lungs, blowing it out again on a long, shuddering breath. Zachary Lowrie had been right. Almost as soon as he was in his grave, Weem had talked his easygoing brother into agreeing that they should replace the Zulus with a drifter, which they would crew together, with Weem as skipper and Albert as mate. There was one snag. As the old man had pointed out, steam drifters cost a lot of money. Between them, the Zulus only cleared 1/3 of the cost of a steamboat, and although both Weem and Albert were prepared to take on a hefty loan from the bank, the debt would have been crippling. That was when James became important to his father's calculations. When he closed his eyes, he could still see the pub that the 3 of them had visited after inspecting the Fidelity, which was up for sale and lying in Fraserburgh Harbour.
"She's a grand boat. We'll all agreed on that," Weem had said, and the other 2 had nodded vigorously. "But the cost of her! The bank won't lend us all that money. Who'd have thought good Zulus would raise so little? The value of sailed boats has gone down, Da, because more and more folk like us want to turn to the steam drifters." "Aye," Weem tugged thoughtfully at his beard, then said, "Another Zulu to sell would make all the difference." "We've not got another." Albert's eyes were on the barmaid's round backside as she bent over a nearby table.
"No," Weem said, then slowly with emphasis on the second word.
"No, we don't. But I was speaking to Mauser Buchan the other day. His chest that bad that he's having to give up the fishing, poor man, and him with his 3 lads drowned 2 years back, and nobody left to sail his boat out for him. A fine Zulu lying idle in the harbour with neither a skipper nor a crew." Mauser's surely not wanting to come in with us at his age? Albert asked. No, the sea's done with the man, poor soul. But there's other ways. James, fetch more drink for us. I'll go, Albert offered swiftly, but his brother clamped a hand on his arm when he made to rise from the table. You'll bide where you are and leave that lassie alone. We're not looking to start trouble with the Fraserburgh men over any barmaid. James?
Waiting for his turn to be served, James saw his father and uncle in deep conversation, heads close together. Once he was back at the table, Weem said, I was just saying to Albert here that Mauser's daughter's not spoken for. James took a deep drink from his tankard and summoned Stella Buchan to mind. She'd been in his class at school, a quiet sort of lass, brown-haired and brown-eyed, not interesting enough to attract his attention.
What about it? A young fisherman like yourself could do a lot worse than buying a share in a fine steam drifter. Just think of the fish we could get to the shore in that beauty we saw today. Me? I only earn what you pay me. How could I buy a share in any drifter? If you'd a sailed boat, you'd make enough from the sale of it to buy a share in that very drifter we saw less than an hour since. James choked on his drink. Are you talking about me offering for Stella Buchan? He spluttered, wiping his mouth with one sleeve. She's a bonny enough lassie, Albert put in, adding hurriedly. Not that I've had any dealings with her myself, you understand. You hear that, James? Who's a better judge of women than your uncle, eh? Famed the length and breadth of the Murray coast. Weem slapped his brother on the back, and Albert grinned. Although he had never married, every one of his large brood had a different mother. I've not thought of marrying yet. Have you no sense in your head at all? If you want to be in that bonny drifter when the next herring season comes round, you'll get a ring on that quine's finger before some other lad comes up with the same thought. I know Mauser would be proud to see the two of you settled together. You've spoken to the man behind my back. To clear your way, just. And it would suit him fine to know his lass had a good, hard-working man to look out for her. And what does Stella say to it all? I suppose you've spoken to her behind my back and all. Don't be so daft, Weem said in his most reasonable voice. All the lassies of marriageable age have their eyes on you, and Stella Buchan's no different. If you're half the man I think you are, you'll welcome a wife with such a fine dowry. James, footloose and fancy-free, had fought against the idea, but in the end he came to realise that his father was right when he said that selling off 3 Zulus instead of 2 was the only way to raise enough money to buy the Fidelity. And he wanted the drifter just as much as his father and uncle did. He wanted her from the moment he first saw her in the harbour at Fraserburgh. So he had married Stella Buchan, and the Zulu was sold within a week of the marriage. A week later, he was a shareholder in the Fidelity. Albert giving up his own Zulu gives him the right to be mate, Weem had explained to his son, but his heart's not in the fishing, like ours. He'd far rather be in bed with a woman than out on the boat, and once we've cleared our debt with the bank, you and me can buy him out. Then you'll be mate and follow me as skipper when I give up the sea, or when it takes me. But the bank loan was still outstanding on the boat when, in a cruel twist of fate, Weem's heart gave out one morning just after they had finished hauling in the catch. If only the man could have been struck down while working the nets moments earlier, James thought, sucking hard on his cigarette. He might have toppled over the side and been dragged to the seabed by the weight of his boots and his clothing. Instead, he had collapsed onto the deck planks almost at his son's feet, and as a result he now lay in rich farming earth, away from the sound and taste and feel of the firth he had lived on for most of his life. It's only natural for her to want to know where he is, Stella had tried to explain to James before the funeral. Her 3 brothers had drowned during a bad storm, and the misery of not knowing where they lay had tormented her mother for the rest of her life. It's not her right at all, he railed back at her. He always said that when his time came, he'd be with the sea.
But she had not understood. And why should she? James thought wearily now, reaching for another cigarette. She was only a woman, with no understanding of fishermen and the ways that were important to them. Chapter 3. James's hand had been stinging for some time before he realised that the glowing cigarette butt was clenched between two fingers, burning the skin. Cursing, he threw it overboard as the moon ripped another hole in the ragged clouds and peered at him, its light picking out the wintry white glitter of spray on the crests of the heaving, tossing waves. A wind had come up, and the boat was beginning to dance restlessly. He knew that he should call the others on deck, but he also knew that in the calm depths below the stormy surface, the silver darlings were tangling themselves into Fidelity's nets. If Albert Lowrie, sleeping soundly in his bunk at that moment, was made aware of the worsening weather, he would head for shore, abandoning the catch. So James did nothing. By dawn, the sea was worse, and the first of the light showed that some of the boats in the distance were getting up steam and hauling in their nets hurriedly, preparing to run for shelter. The rest of the crew arrived on deck, pulling on jerseys and sou'westers as they tumbled out of the galley.
Damn you, James! Why didn't you call us up sooner?
Albert was having difficulty in knuckling the sleep from his eyes.
It's just a wee swell. Plenty of time to get the nets inboard. A wee swell!
Albert barked, staggering and grabbing for a handhold as the Fidelity reared up like a nervous horse.
You damned young fool! You'll not be content till you drown the lot of us!
As he roared down to the engine driver and trimmer to come up on deck and lend a hand, and the steam capstan leaped into action, James grinned to himself, throwing away his half-smoked cigarette and moving to the starboard bulwarks, where he held on with one hand and leaned precariously over the side, heedless of the waves thundering in on the boat. It was there, glimpsed beneath the water's foaming surface as the first net was coaxed slowly and steadily upwards, the faintly milky tinge that quickly became a silvery shimmer. Although he had seen that same glimmer rising towards him from below the waves on countless occasions, James's body still tingled with a surge of elation and excitement. It was what he was born for, what he and the others risked their lives for over and over again.
It's a good shot today, lads!
He shouted over his shoulder to the rest of the crew, waiting in a line along the deck.
Didn't I tell you when we got here that I could smell the herring?
You and your bloody nose, his uncle grunted, his own eyes fixed on the dark sky above. The weather was closing in fast now, but as the seas raced in on her from all sides, the boat fought back, twisting and rolling and righting herself every time, only to stagger as another huge wave crashed towards her, then rally and begin the struggle for survival again. Each time she rolled to port, the deckhands dug their feet firmly into the angle formed by bulwarks and deck, twisted their hands into the thick wet mesh emerging slowly from the water, and then leaned back with all their weight. The trick was to hold tight to the net, which was being lifted from the sea by the rolling action of the boat itself. Over she went, until she was close to lying on her port side, the men almost horizontal on the steeply sloping deck, teeth gritted hard and muscles screaming with the effort of pulling the net along with them. The capstan roared as it hauled in the great messenger rope inch by bitter inch. When she had rolled as far as was safe, the Fidelity hesitated, as though making a choice between living and dying, then deciding, she began to reverse the roll. The men came upright with her. Then, as she began to pitch to starboard, threatening to take the emerging nets with her, they leaned forward, clawing at the mesh, their fingers slipping among the tightly packed fish. The steam capstan spun faster now, gathering in foot after foot of the messenger. Then, as the vessel reached the furthest edge of her roll, the net exploded onto the decking among them, filling up every inch and forcing them back towards the gaping maw of the hold while it spilled out its catch, until the crew were knee-deep in hundreds, thousands of leaping silvery fish. Now they began to work as one, each man concentrating on his own given task. Jem caught up a wooden shovel and began to scoop the herring towards the hold, as another man deftly disconnected the netting from the messenger rope. 2 more detached the round canvas buoys and tossed them into a corner of the deck, out of the way. In the soaking, dark rope locker, the lad feverishly coiled the dripping rope, while in the hold, Charlie and the 3 other men used their wide wooden herring shovels to scoop to the sides the torrent of fish descending on them in order to make room for the herring following on. When the net was freed from the messenger, it too went into the hold, while the men disentangled those fish still caught by the gills in the mesh before bundling it up and clearing it out of the way. Later, it would be shaken out and folded and properly stowed, but in the meantime, the fight was already on for the next length of netting.
"The weather's getting worse," Albert shouted. "There's time yet, and fish." James tossed the words briskly over his shoulder. All that mattered was getting the fish aboard. Even with the assistance of the steam capstan, the job of bringing a good catch inboard was back-breaking work. Spray and sweat mingled to run down the crew's faces, their necks, their backs beneath the layers of warm clothing. Their oilskins dripped salt water and their feet skidded on the slippery fish scales. Albert roared an oath as he almost fell after his heel landed on a lump of jelly-like substance that had fallen from the net. "Watch what you're about, man," he barked at a young deckhand who had just managed to free a hand and was about to scrub some spray from his face. "There's scalders in the nets. Touch your face and you'll burn your eyes out."
Scalders were a type of jellyfish that covered the fishermen's hands with a toxic, stinging slime which passed to anything they touched. The only solution to the agony of burning eyes or mouths was to wash the afflicted areas with fresh water, but when the nets were coming inboard, there was no time for such niceties. A wave larger than the others caught the boat, lifting it up, then letting it slide down a long, steep flank. It rolled sickeningly, and a mass of green water poured inboard. Down and down the boat went, dropping fast enough to leave James suspended almost knee-deep in the sea. For a long, breath-stopping moment, he hung onto the net, waiting. Then the deck came back up with all the strength of the next wave beneath it, slamming against the soles of his iron-nailed boots with a solid thud that vibrated right through him to the top of his skull. He grinned, relishing the stomach-churning thrill of the experience. One of these days, he and the boat might well part company in such a sea, and he would either topple forward into the net among the thrashing fish or be carried straight to the seabed far below by the weight of his iron-studded boots. If that should happen, he would not struggle, for it would be what fate had intended for him all along. The next time the boat rolled, Albert, too, was left suspended in the water for long seconds before the deck heaved up beneath him, sending him staggering. He immediately announced that they were heading back.
"But the hold's not full,"
James yelled against the banshee howling of the wind.
"I'm not minded to lose the boat for the sake of a few more cran of herring. We've enough fish. Jockey, Clake, down below with you and get these engines going."
"When did a fisherman ever have enough?" James shouted, and was ignored. As they passed those boats still fishing the great stretch of the bank, every vessel heeling over sharply as its crew wrestled with the nets, James felt humiliated to be heading for safety. In his father's day, he raged inwardly as he and the others stored the buoys and, retrieving the nets from the hold, piled them to one side after the last of the fish had been shaken free. The Fidelity had been known to wallow back to port with her hold filled to capacity and her decks piled so high with baskets of fish that she was more often below the water than above it. To his own mind, it was a crime to own and skipper a good steam drifter like Fidelity and not use it properly. Albert, damn him, might as well own a wee rowing boat and a few lobster pots, for he'd no proper understanding of the way to treat a good vessel. Davy Geddes came to mind, a man in his early 60s, still wiry and strong, but beginning by his own admission to slow down.
A man has to be fast on his feet and quick with his thinking if he's to face the sea on its own terms,
he had said when he and James met in the public house a few days before.
Although the Lord's been good to me, I believe he's decided that the time's come for me to spend more of my energy on doing his work instead of my own. You're looking for another crew member?
Unlike most fishermen, James was not a strong Christian, and sometimes he found such talk confusing.
I'm looking for a mate, lad. Jack's the same age as myself, and to my mind there's nobody else in the crew ready to take on such responsibility yet. Since the Lord never saw fit to bless the wife and me with sons, I'm looking for a good man to sail with me during the next season so he can get to know the boat. Then he'll take it over when I leave. A man like yourself, James, though I doubt if you'd want to leave the family boat.
Davy raised his eyebrows when James said that he might be willing to make the change, but merely said,
No hurry. We'll both think on it and pray for guidance, and when the answer's been given to each of us, we can talk about it.
It was a good offer. Davy's boat was sailed, but sturdy, with years of good use in her yet. However, James knew that there would be a third member in the partnership, the God that Davy introduced into almost every sentence he spoke. James had heard that the old man led his crew in prayer before the nets were shot and after they were hauled, no matter how great or small the catch. Davy's mate and partner would be expected to be a regular churchgoer, which would please Stella, who had tried in vain when they first married to persuade her husband to attend Sunday worship with her. Then there was the prospect of leaving Fidelity and giving up all hope of being her master. Putting a hand briefly on the mast, as he straightened from working on the nets, James felt the heart of the boat throb and sing through the timber beneath his palm. His father had fallen in love with her at first sight, wooed her like a lover, and bonded so strongly with her that flesh and wood had become one. James ached to do the same. It would be hard to leave her. Once the work was done, it was James's turn to rest. Bone-weary though he was, he tossed in his narrow bunk, the thud and judder of the engines echoing through his skull. Although the steam drifters were faster, and their engines removed the punishing physical work of hoisting and trimming sails, they were not as comfortable as the sailed boats. Steam drifters tended to pitch and jar, while the constant noise from the engine made sleep difficult. He sighed and crossed his arms behind his head. The bunk was narrow and uncomfortable, but at least he was alone in it. At home, Stella would be asleep in their marriage bed, her soft, rounded body heavy with their coming child. Or she might be awake, tending one of the twins, or making a hot poultice for her father's chest. She had a sweet, caring nature, but she was not the right woman for James Lowrie. He had never met the right woman, and perhaps he never would.
There's times, Jess, when I fair envy you with your bairns and your grand wains, Meg Lowrie said as Innes went to the backyard to change out of his dirty overalls and get washed. Times I can't help thinking that if things had been different, I might have had young ones of my own.
Life treated you badly, Meg. James touched her sister-in-law's large, knuckly hand. Meg's young fiancé had been lost at sea just 2 weeks before their wedding, and, since his body had never been recovered, she had never had the chance to say her last farewell or to see him laid to rest in a decent Christian fashion.
Ach, it's the way things go.
Meg, never one to brood, shook off the sympathetic touch.
At least I've always had my health and my strength. But I'd not have minded a nice laddie like your Innes. It was a great disappointment to Weem when the boy refused to crew on his boat.
He didn't refuse, Meg. Jess fought to keep the anger from her voice. He did his best, but he was so sick after those 2 voyages that I couldn't let him try again. If anyone was in the wrong, it was Weem for taking it so badly. Everyone gets sick at first. It passes. Not the way Innes was.